Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Bridging the Gap Between Python Users and IT, Faster Builds, Deployment, and Security. My name is Bree, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to cover some housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, there are some engagement tools you can use to find more information or to interact with our speakers. The tools are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around as you see fit. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. Use the Q&A tool to submit your questions for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we can throughout the duration of the event, and at the end of the webinar, we will have a brief live Q&A. You can download a copy of today's slide deck and additional materials from the resource list. If you need any technical support during the webcast, use the help tool at the bottom of your screen. An on-demand version of this webcast will be available in approximately 24 hours and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. That wraps up the housekeeping notes, so now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker. Hassam has a background in creating and implementing data science solutions for clients in a number of highly regulated industries, including finance, government, healthcare, manufacturing, and more. He helps these highly regulated organizations adopt open source with confidence. Hassam has spent his career championing open source and leads a team of technical advisors who consult on best practices on using Python for enterprises. So now, without further ado, I'll pass this over to Hassam to kick us off.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's session. My name is Hassam Mian. Today, we'll be discussing bridging the gap between Python and IT. And really kind of what we're entailing by that is sharing our learnings while working with many organizations, what we've seen to be the common challenges between the Python user groups, as well as the IT groups that have to support them and actually get the value out of what those user groups generate. A little bit about myself. I'm a senior solutions engineer here. For about 3.5, 4 years now, I've worked with organizations of all sizes, as small as, user groups as small as 5 to user groups as many as 10,000 inside of large institutions. So definitely seen quite a mix of use cases, and we're definitely going to dive deep into what we've seen in the ecosystem and kind of what we can do to help bridge this gap. So for today's overview, we'll do a little bit about Anaconda in case you're unfamiliar. We'll also then introduce how we see open source usage start to rise inside of organization, and what the common patterns are, right? And then with that, we also start to naturally see some great value delivered by Python, but we also start to see some challenges both on the user side as well as the IT side on getting the most from it from an enterprise perspective. We'll also then detail out kind of our learnings and how we delved deep into this problem and have cultivated a platform around a lot of these key challenges that we're seeing. We'll also go through a demo and open it up for any questions that anyone on the call might have. A little bit about Anaconda in case you're unfamiliar. Obviously, a Python company, right? But it's actually one of the easiest ways to get started with Python. And that's actually called our Anaconda distribution. You can go to our website and simply download it and instantly have, a Python environment in which you have the most popular packages. This is something that's completely agnostic of the underlying OS. So we make it really easy for users if they're on Windows, Mac, or Linux. And there's definitely a lot more to this as well. A big aspect of this is Conda does a really, really excellent job of managing those lower level bits, those libraries, those dependencies and environments. And really the takeaway there is because Conda manages that a lot better, users can focus on the code and generating value, right? We make it really easy for them to request the packages they need and make sure that they resolve in stable environments. And because of this, we have over 30 million users. And this is actually something that we're seeing quite a big rise of, as there's lots and lots of more users in the ecosystem, especially enterprise usage, right? So Python is rapidly expanding in the ecosystem, And the reason this is relevant is we're also seeing, some of those challenges as well, which we'll dive into. But let's kind of take a step back and kind of analyze this rise itself, right, before we jump into the challenges. Oftentimes, right, organizations have, some net new initiative or need, or there's a new project, or folks are just delving, into data science for the first time as they mature from, an analyst type of role, right? But typically, Python and R is needed and downloaded, and it's, an example of that is the Anaconda distribution or Anaconda Navigator, right, which is the desktop application, which makes it really easy for folks to download it onto their workstation, their laptop, a basic server, and start to get access to a rich ecosystem of packages that we see in the top right. And this is great to get started. This is great to start to automate tasks, build some scripts, start to train some data, or perhaps even do ETL work, or maybe build a couple fancy visualizations that might explain a lot. And this value generated by the user is great, but on the other side of that coin, there's also this notion of limited visibility and oversight, right? Is, hey, their demands are their demands, and they go out and they get what they need, and it's great, but there's not perhaps a system in place to help control this, right? And oftentimes what they require is coming from a number of different places, right? And so, again, great to get started, but even as soon as we get started, we start to get hit with some visibility issues and, hitting a couple different sources to get what they need. Again, which is great to generate value, but also perhaps starts to pose some initial challenges as well. And so what we've kind of seen, depending on the maturity level of the organization, is they for the most part, they fall into one of these three buckets of, hey, my users are simply out there. I know they're using it, they need it. I simply don't have a way to provide any oversight or any system in place to help manage this, right? And so that's typically this no oversight item. Or organizations say, hey, there is a process in place, but it's extremely manual. Or there might also be some sort of automated system, which is, hey, this is something we've devised, maybe not the best, but it gets us for the time being. And I'd actually like to simplify it even further, almost boil it down, but this notion of no oversight is really kind of like the wild, wild west, right? Where my data scientists are out there, my users are out there, they're accessing packages from various places. They're downloading them on various pieces of infrastructure, using them to generate various pieces of code that I really don't have much oversight on, right? It's kind of like no man's land. Um, or that step up is that manual processes, which is obviously, the organization has adopted a methodology of putting some guardrails in place, but perhaps still in a very ad hoc or DIY fashion, right? Where it's still a very manual process for the users to generate something, and perhaps even a more manual process to then do something with that. And really what I mean is I've seen many examples where, the users are developing on their desktops, right? And then in order to kind of get that out in production, it has to often, exchange hands with IT, and often has to go through multiple iterations of recoding it or refactoring it, and often with delay, right? And again, all manually done. Um, or there's often an automated system in place. And this automated system oftentimes is a homegrown system, right? Which is often actually glue around these manual processes that we just mentioned, right? For time-saving purposes, not necessarily for optimizing the amount of lift, but perhaps minimizing time, which is great, but also the downsides of something that's homegrown often is a limited set of capabilities or a lot of continuous upkeep, right, of the system. Whereas, you know, there definitely might be a better way, right, and a simpler way with less lift to achieve the exact same things, and often perhaps provide even additional capabilities. And so, hint, hint, little teaser for the rest of the conversation. But this is generally kind of what we've seen with organizations as they adopt open source. right? Definitely great to get started. And as they get started, they mature slowly into one of these three buckets, right? Sometimes they mature into, from no oversight to manual processes, or sometimes they stay. But really, kind of what we're here to do is talk about those challenges and talk about how we at Anaconda can help. And so I also wanted to actually spend a second and go through this State of Data Science report that we did last year. This is a report that we do here at Anaconda, where we reach out to a lot of our individuals in the ecosystem and enterprises for various survey questions. And what I find very interesting about this one is the top challenges when it comes to getting to production, right? So we can spend a second to kind of look at some of these top ones, such as InfoSec standards and IT standards, data security, connectivity, recoding models. That's actually something we just spoke about. Managing package dependencies. That's kind of relevant for that wild, wild west notion, right? Um, but what we found very interesting is if we actually take a step back, we can bucket this into two major categories that we've seen. And obviously there's flavors to it, but if we just really boil it down, it comes into two notions of security and infrastructure, and at times a combination, right? Whereas anything in relation to data and standards, right, often falls into security. Um, and so do packages, right? That's another aspect that absolutely should be considered in that security topic. And then we also see that there are also a lot of infrastructure challenges, such as recoding those models. Managing packages and environments in a place is an infrastructure item as well, right? Offering additional compute resources or having to move to the cloud or inability to actually deploy models in production today, right, is an infrastructure item. So whether it's recoding, whether it's managing, whether it's providing compute, uh, we definitely see a lot of security and infrastructure topics here. And some of these are extremely relevant to what we talked about just now, and also very relevant for the exact use cases that we've seen out in the field with many organizations and what we've helped with. Is first and foremost, right, if we think about any data science workflow, it genuinely begins with the packages. And so some organizations have a focus on package management and security, and some don't. One thing that we can definitely detail out is package security is a big concern, right, for many organizations. And not just security, but managing this and ensuring that whatever is offered to the user group is done so with rationale and reason, right? And oftentimes it's difficult for an independent organization to come upon this security rationale themselves. Well, this is absolutely where, hey, we, Anaconda, the builders of these packages, right, can absolutely offer visibility into whether or not these certain packages, versions, builds should or shouldn't be used, given perhaps vulnerabilities that exist within them, or perhaps bug fixes, right, that make them no longer a concern. So again, at the beginning of the data science workflow, it's really all about packages, right? And many organizations today are having issues with accessing packages. Oftentimes there's a manual IT approval process, right, to even get those packages. So imagine a 1 week, 2 week delay just to even get started, right? Just to even get started with generating something with Python. Now let's move along that, right? Once we've actually start to have our packages, now we're actually developing code, which is great, right? But oftentimes it's done with silos. And so this is where users often express issues with collaboration, antiquated processes of sharing projects with one another, sharing code with one another, and then having to manually resolve that environment, right? Which kind of brings us into that reproducibility as not only is it a pain to collaborate with one another, but it's also a pain to reproduce these assets with each other to develop with one another, right? Uh, and reproducing these assets also becomes especially relevant, right, as the need to scale these projects. Sure, year one, small data sizes, right? But eventually, right, those data volumes will get to a point where additional compute resources will be needed, And so we want to provide a very easy and scalable way to scale these resources out. And a big item, deployment. This is something that we briefly just talked about in the last one that we saw in the survey, is getting items into production, managing items into production, having to recode things from Python and R just to play nicely with an existing or antiquated deployment process. Okay, so and oftentimes the users don't have the ability to create deployments themselves, and this is a big challenge that we've seen. Is the folks that are behind the steering wheel often need to take their car out on the track to test it, right? And oftentimes they have to wait for an entire pit crew to help them get out there. Whereas, hey, I just need to quickly test this model. I just need to quickly visualize what this dashboard looks like. Or hey, I, you know, let me get an MVP of an API out there very simply, right? So I can continue to iterate. And so we've seen a lot of challenges in this space as well. Not only myself, but again, that data science report that we've done last year as well. And finally, governance, right, which is not necessarily a separate pillar, but it's actually something that sits above and beneath everything that we've talked about already, right? Ensuring that the packages, the security aspect, the licenses, who has access to what for what purpose is governed and managed in an appropriate way, and also ensuring that whoever's working on various projects using these resources, right, is managed, and also who has the ability to actually deploy, and once deployed, who has the ability to actually consume, right? So there's all these governance and management aspects that need to be considered or often are intertwined with the challenges, right? And so it's typically a combination of these challenges that makes it really difficult for people to actually do something about. And so that's why they fall into the bucket of the wild, wild west, right? Or the manual processes, or they've understood that it's a combination of these challenges and they've built a homegrown system. But even then, there perhaps is areas for optimization in the workflow. And so, with a focus on those challenges, right, we here at Anaconda have built a process where, really simply put, we've allowed it to be really easy for users to be able to quickly develop and collaborate with each other while also providing a system where they can deploy, right, while making sure that they're accessing all of those packages in a secure fashion and able to refine those models, refine those dashboards, all within a uh, IT governed way, right? It's essentially an application, a drop-in application that really makes it easy for IT organizations to manage this workflow while also providing all of the bells and whistles directly to the user. And so let's talk about those bells and whistles, right? And so one of the big value props that organizations see valuable about Anaconda and this platform is the fact that they're no longer developing on the desktop, right? We already talked about how the desktop can bring a lot of challenges. Well, no longer is sensitive data on the desktop, no longer will packages be downloaded on the desktop, no longer will the projects live on the desktop, right? Essentially, the workstation or the laptop or whatever the user interface is, all is needed is a web browser. And so users are actually developing inside of the web browser, which is happening on a server or a cluster that's owned by an IT organization. There's also some assistance that Anaconda has in managing those clusters, but that's a topic for another time. If relevant, more than happy to talk about it. And so users are essentially interacting with their web browser where they can log in with SSO and Active Directory LDAP integration. From here, users are easily able to access the central homepage of their projects and their team members' projects. They can pop into it, they can actually add resources to it, they can select a different editor that they'd like to develop with. In fact, inside of the platform, you can choose from Jupyter Notebooks, Jupyter Lab, RStudio, and VS Code. From here, it's pulling from the secure package repository that we've already discussed. Users are able to attach GPUs, CPUs, and as many as the administrator has given them access to. With that integrated Git system, as users are developing in their own isolated sessions, they can actually collaborate with one another, and Git is tracking those items. And once they're done collaborating, if a user has that permission, they can actually turn their Python work into a deployed result, being a API, a model, a read-only notebook, a custom dashboard with interactivity and user parameters, or perhaps even a custom web application. And all of this is essentially being orchestrated on Kubernetes. And as far as flavors of Kubernetes, this is where the platform is very agnostic, whether on-prem, whether on cloud. And if you can't manage it, not a problem. You know, Anaconda can still help. But just down below, we see a few different flavors. And the nice thing about it is Anaconda and the platform, it's really a development and compute platform, right? Your data sources are your data sources. The credentials and security that you have at that layer will persist. Essentially, users will be using packages to be able to interact with the data sources, and whatever their existing credentials get them access to would be the data that they can pull into memory inside of the platform. And so, just an example of collaboration, you'll actually see it in the demo itself. Um, But the big value add behind the project sessions is the fact that not only when you collaborate with users are you collaborating on the user code, but you're also managing the dependencies, right? So as the packages change, as the environment changes, as those dependencies get added or removed from the project, that's also being critically tracked alongside that uh, uh, code as well. And so the reason this is relevant is this collaboration model really allows you to deploy previous versions of the code in association with that environment that was used, right? So it's really great to revert back for compliance, auditing, governance purposes, or also in case you need to roll back to a previous production model. You also can roll back to the exact environment that was used for that model. And from a deployment perspective, I touched on it, but these are a few visual examples, right? Off to our left, we have interactive Python dashboards using a package called Panel. Powerful, powerful visualization package, by the way, and you'll actually see another example in the demo. But what's unique about that is it's allowing user input, allowing a user to be able to selectively filter, right, upon one of those charts and graphs. Also off to our right, we see examples of read-only notebooks. This is a really easy way where users can deploy their analysis, explain their analysis without necessarily having others alter their code. It's a great way to publish code to share with other teams so they can actually take snippets, right, of perhaps your code or really inspiration, right, to drive additional value on their project. I know Anaconda is very synonymous with Python, but I also want one thing understood, which is we also do have plenty of support for R packages, right? And so within the platform, users can not only select R Studio, but users can also select R Shiny dashboards, right, as a deployment model. And in the middle here, we actually have a custom Flask application, right? So showcasing that for any custom web applications that you need, this can still absolutely be a platform to assist you. And in fact, this was a Flask application that we built, and what we do is we feed it a JPEG file, and it compares it against a TensorFlow model that we've built. And then off to our right, something that a lot of organizations really, really value is this notion of building REST APIs and getting the models out there, right, for other users, for other applications to be able to quickly score data against to get predictions. So that's been a real powerful item here. So let's actually see it in action now. All right, so let's go ahead and log into the platform. And again, like I mentioned, this can absolutely be integrated with LDAP, Active Directory, SSO. And so as we log in here, essentially have this central homepage. And this homepage is where I see my projects, and I also see projects that have been created by someone else. Here in the top right, I can quickly create a project. And from here, I can select a specific version of Python or Anaconda, or I can select R, and newer versions can absolutely be supported. And here I can actually access resources. And this is something where it's fully customizable by the organization and the admin team. And GPUs can absolutely be added. So here I'm just showcasing just quickly uh, the creation of a test project, but let's quickly pop into a sample project here, or the gallery. Now, this is a gallery of projects that come pre-populated with Anaconda Enterprise. These are various projects to help you achieve certain items, such as building APIs or accessing databases. But the reason I wanted to showcase this is you can actually customize this, right? And so if there's any standard projects or templates or any standard environments that you'd like to make available to your team as a foundation, that project can be populated here so the users can actually copy that onto their home page and use it as the launching point. So let's go over to our home page again where we've copied that project, that Markowitz notebook, and let's actually go ahead and select it. And so here, again, we have access to change the resources. So again, 2 CPUs, 4 gigs of memory or more. And again, that's customizable. And we see a few different editors here. Again, the two that you're not seeing are VS Code and RStudio. Those are something that we do at implementation time, but those are absolutely editors that are available. And so off to our left, we see we have a few different sections associated to the project. So let's go ahead and open an active session. And what we're doing right now is actually spinning up resources, right? So a Kubernetes pod is being reserved. This project is being copied into that pod, and those packages will start to automatically get installed on behalf of the user. So we're going to spin up a Jupyter environment here. And here we have Jupyter Lab, right? Now, the thing to notice is we have our project items off to our left. And in this case, we have our notebook, fairly straightforward. And in this case, we're essentially just doing various stock analysis, calculations, and visualizations here. So let's go ahead and give it a run through. And we've generated our results, right? So very standard Jupyter Notebook use case. And so this is just a quick run through of a notebook, but let's talk about that deployment aspect, right? So in the top right, we see deploy. And so what I've quickly just done here is create a deployment from this notebook. And so if we move over to our deployments aspect here, we can see that we are now kicking up a new pod specific for your deployment. And just like that, we'll also get notified that that is ready to interact with. And what we see is that exact same notebook that we just had in the project session, we see it published here, right? And in a very similar fashion, I can actually run through the code. Now, this specific notebook is actually deployed at this URL. And just like that, we've made it very easy, right, to publish this notebook, put it out in front of the business, add a very specific URL. And as this URL is shared with other individuals, right, they'll be prompted to log in. And if they have access to that deployment, they'll be able to see it. And this is, again, something that is totally manageable by your admin team. And so after we authenticate, here we have our published result. And so we've made it really, really easy for folks to be able to deploy something and have an authentication protocol, right, sit right behind it. And so this is something that's completely read-only for someone to kind of walk through. And again, a great way to show some results without having them to change it. And here, this is where on the deployment itself, I could specifically choose individual users, right, that I wanted to add, or I could also add a group of users as well. And so as they log in, right, they'll see that they'll have access to that deployment. So let's go back here to our homepage and select a different project, this bike share project. Let's talk about the audit trail, right, where we can quickly see the history associated with a project, when a project was created or when a version was edited, if there was any issues with the project itself. Again, we've already talked about adding users, but let's talk about scheduling, right? In the Python ecosystem, there's all types of needs for pre-processing, post-processing, ETL jobs, refreshing models and whatnot, automating scripts, running scripts. So there's all sorts of reasons why you may want to automate a certain job. And this is where you would do so, right? Where you have the ability to select the previous version of a project or the latest version. And within that project, you have the ability to select a very specific task or command, right? You could have multiple different tasks in a project, and you may want to schedule a particular one. And you also have the ability to select the resources as well as schedule, right, aligned to that scheduled job. And this is something that you can automate with cron as well, if you have any of those expressions readily handy. And again, let's pop into a project session, right? But instead of the Markowitz notebook, we're actually going to pop into the bike share model. And so again, right, project items off to our left, we still have access to our terminal down below. So keep that in mind. Here we have a very standard notebook. And what we're doing here is actually reading in bike share data. We're trying to predict the amount of bikes that will be rented out in the city of Pittsburgh. And what I just showcased there was how you would access data, specifically from something like Hadoop. And so with the rest of this use case, essentially we're cleaning data, right? We're adding in additional data such as weather data. We also add in baseball data, whether or not the local baseball team was playing. And from here, we start to build some features. Features around temperature, month, holiday, weekend, and home game to build that table. And from here, we use scikit-learn, right, to generate a model. And what we're seeing here is temperature is obviously one of the leading causes of variance. And what we've done is actually exported that pickle file, right? And in this next notebook, what we do is we actually load up that pickle file to be able to then create a REST API. And so down below, we're using Tranquilizer to build a predict function, saying, hey, utilizing that model file that we just made, generate this result. And in this case, we see a prediction. One thing I'd like to call out is this Anaconda project YAML file, right? This is a very powerful file because it's specifically the one that captures the specific versions of the packages as well as the specific commands to schedule or deploy. And as the code is changing, this is also being committed. And again, these are the items that show up here in the deployment wizard. Okay, let's back out of here and let's talk a little bit about version control, right? So let's pop over to this notebook and let's say that I came in here and I changed a model, I made some sort of update, right? And I saved this notebook. Well, in the top right, what we're noticing is we actually have this Git integration here. And this is showcasing that, hey, we've noticed that this file changed since last time. We have the ability to come in here and add in a commit message, right? So let's say we've added an update to the project, ready to deploy, and we can also select the latest version, right, that we want to tag it as. And once that's committed, right, we also have one that is for fetching, right, in case we were on the other side of that. But once that's committed, we have the ability where we can actually select that latest version here. And so we're really bringing back the power, right, to deploy back into the data scientist's hands, right? Make it really easy for them to be able to deploy their items. And in fact, let's go take a look at a deployment that I already previously had deployed. And so in this use case, right, we see that deployed API and we see the exact same predict function, right? So we can actually give it a singular go here if we wanted to, or we can actually just like the notebook, right? Copy the URL and access it just like we would from outside of the platform. And so let's give it a single data point here, say it's 75 degrees. Um, and let's go ahead and execute. And we see that given those input parameters, we see a prediction of 415 bikes to be rented out. And again, that URL is where that predict function sits. And again, if you needed to share this with other users or groups, we have the ability to do that here. And we can also interact with groups that are brought in via LDAP or Active Directory. And so here we have a global list, right, of our deployments. I can see deployments by me. I can also see deployments by someone else. And in this case, we see another notebook visualization here that someone has built out. So this is just one example, right? The API is another example, but let's showcase another example, which is actually this portfolio optimizer dashboard, which is something I really like because it showcases that we can build these projects in such a way that offer filters, interactivity, and parameters back to the end users. So they don't have to be the data scientists, right? The project can still do all the optimization, the simulation, and whatnot, but there's still value, right, for the individual analyst to interact with this type of result. And in this example, right, we've reran the analysis using a subset of the stock analysis data that we have access to. And in fact, if we wanted to give it additional data, we could as well. And so one of the key takeaways that I want to get across here is that Anaconda can not only be used to build dashboards, notebooks, and publish those, but also for this to be a system to be used to generate business applications fueled by data science, right? And so in this example, again, right, I as an end user don't have to have any visibility or knowledge of simulation, optimization, and whatnot. I can simply interact with the parameters and still generate the results, right, using that behind the scenes data science aspect that was coded into the project. So this is very, very strong for creating these types of business applications, as well as, you know, dashboards, notebooks, and REST APIs. So with that, I think let's just pop in for a recap and we should be able to open it up for questions. And so I also just wanted to open it back up to the recap, which, as we talked about today, right, not only have we seen in the ecosystem, but according to kind of the industry survey report as well, right, package security management is a big notion here, right? And inside of the application, the platform, we've made it really easy to provide that environment where folks can comfortably install those packages while also ensuring that the admins, right, are ensuring that those packages installed there have passed the appropriate security and vetting process, right? And that's information that we provide on. And that's also probably a topic that we'll discuss on another webinar for folks interested is security around packages itself. Next, we absolutely talked about collaboration, right? And talked about the challenges with, you know, sharing flat files or having to reproduce the environment and how inside of the platform really installs those packages on your behalf. Any packages that are needed can instantly be installed inside of that project, and we can scale that project up and down, right, with those additional cores, additional gigs of memory, and also possible GPUs if that's something that your organization is interested in. And I really hope you saw how easy it was to deploy inside of the platform, right? So we really want to get away from a lot of that, having to recode, you know, pass it off to IT. We really want to put the tools back in the hands of the developers for them to be able to test and iterate, right? And it doesn't have to be put in everyone's hands, right? That can still be put in an administrator's hands, but it definitely offers more capabilities to quickly get that API, notebook, web app, dashboard out there. And obviously, we talked extensively about the governance model, right, around the projects, around the deployments, around the resources. Uh, So definitely something to keep in mind, right? That individual edition is great to get started. That's how folks start prototyping and start generating value inside of an organization. But also with those come challenges, right? The challenges of the Wild West, the manual processes, or perhaps even a homegrown approach, right? And what we've done here at Anaconda is work very closely with our enterprise clients and cultivated an enterprise edition, right, to help manage risks, to help organizations and user groups collaborate and develop with each other, and also provide a very easy way to deploy, and in fact, deploy with one click while keeping security, versioning, governance, and audit all in mind for the IT stakeholders within the organization. So if this is something that you have additional questions around or use cases or comments, please feel free to use this opportunity to dive into some questions. Thanks again for attending. And if you have any questions, now is definitely the time. Happy to help.